Okay, welcome back, everyone. And now we are ready for the cross-examination of the assessment committee. And now I give the words to Diane Gersberg. The floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So first of all, Lennert, thank you for an excellent presentation. Just a quick thought that so much of what you talked about mirrors what we are experiencing here in Alaska. Whether it's our less than successful attempt at a one-to-one computing laptop initiative, or that our schools are certainly not resourced sufficiently to reach the desired outcomes we have. We have issues with accountability not being tied to what we are teaching and learning, or at least to what we hope we are teaching and learning. And we also face many reductionist measures of compliance that are imposed by policymakers who are not educators. And finally, we experience very high teacher turnover, especially in our more rural and remote schools. And we do not have the capacity within our state to prepare enough teachers to fill our openings, and we never have. So it's very reminiscent. So I probably have more questions than our time allows, but I know you and I will keep having this conversation after. I'm going to start with that in your conclusion, in your dissertation, you talk about implications for practice and you give recommendations for new evaluation practice and monitoring. But you don't discuss how you get policymakers, school administrators, teachers, and parents to adopt new practices. What do you see as the steps for getting these key actors to see the value of adopting new indicators? For example, one thing is you mentioned the lack of will among actors, but to what extent do you think it's that, or is it that people have been subject to a colonized system for so long that they may not have a vision of a system that looks different and that values students and learning differently?
Thank you for your question, Diane. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, you can. It is a very interesting question, and it calls for the importance of discussing this more widely. The concept of quality is very broad and hard to grasp for many, and therefore it is also very difficult to assign simple indicators. Like there's not just one indicator that can fully describe what quality in the classrooms are. So there's definitely need to discuss what types of indicators could better measure qualities. I don't think it's a lack of will per se to not want to measure the quality of education, because in the discourse is very much that, like, whenever something comes up, we talk about the quality of the school, both among politicians and among in the university and so on. So there's no so the will to discuss is there. I just think it needs to be facilitated with in terms of bringing down the abstractness of the concept, so that more can participate in the discussion in a good way. Does that answer your question?
That definitely answers the first part. And I just wonder also if, even in facilitating this conversation, if maybe you might address sort of that historic, the nature of the colonial system that pretty much everybody has experienced up until recent decades. To what extent is that shaping people's participation in these conversations or their thinking about the conversations?
Yeah. Let me just think for a second.
It's a question that is several dissertations in and of itself.
Yeah, but I think my take on this is that childcare and schooling has been institutionalized when comparing it to from before colonization, where this has been the responsibilities of families and communities to raise children and to educate children. But now this responsibility has been transferred to institutions such as daycares and schools. So I think there's, in that sense, I don't know how to describe it, but it's hard to separate where the responsibility is when there has been this institutionalization and the traditions we have had before. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
That's part of it, and that actually leads right into one of my other questions, because when you talked about the early learning system, again, another parallel to our conversations here, and work we're doing about trying to create more culturally responsive practice for early learning and childcare settings that serve indigenous children in Alaska. And one of the challenges we're having is the very Western ways of measuring quality in an early learning setting don't recognize the different ways that children at home are taught to learn and to express what they are learning. And one of the stark examples is a very widely used, nationally validated measure that wants to see young children verbally responding and asking questions and interacting that way. And for our Yupik and Inupiaq children, quite often the response is a raised eyebrow. Yeah. And so even how does that play into what we talk about for quality early learning?
Yeah.
I guess I might ask, what structural changes do you think need to be made? And this is, again, just from your experience observing, and this is another dissertation, but not just in the governance, but also in the process of schooling itself. So you gave a really nice description of, for example, changing classroom environments, which are needed, and also the challenges teachers face and how students are responding to the education structures. But do you have a vision of what you think a successful system would look like in terms of pedagogy and curriculum? That's the first part. And the second question that goes with it is, to what extent do you think a change in the mindset and approach to evaluative thinking will lead to some of the changes you'd like to see?
Regarding the first question, I cannot go into much detail because I have not been trained in pedagogy and therefore have So I will try not to get too deep into that, but I think it's overall it's very important that we have that our way of teaching in the schools also reflects our way of thinking about the world, like our world views. Like I said in a sentence during the defense that it is hard for children to belong in schools if they can't see themselves there. So in what ways can we structure the curriculum so that it is more based on what the children see in their home communities, what they experience, what their activities are outside of the classrooms and the school, and how to better incorporate that into the school so that it feels more at home, like it's more natural. And regarding to your next questions about how to embed, how embedding evaluative thinking can improve the systems, so I've analyzed the education system and the governance systems and looked at how this system is monitored, and it's in what I said about half a performance management system, right? It's you do all the work, but you don't take the advantages of that work and that information and use it to improve school practice and the schools and the way you administer them. And that is partly due to a lack of capacity to do so, both in terms of personnel and like in the municipalities there are sometimes there's only one person who sits alone with the education area, and they don't only sit with the education area, they sit with other areas too. So it's not hard to imagine why there's this type of process compliance culture, because there's simply no time for development. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and we see very similarly that particularly when you talk about special education and our structure, the amount of paperwork required just takes away the ability of educators to focus on the next day's process for reaching children, because you have to do, there's so much compliance, it's very hard. So this question is this is the pushing into sort of the radically different territory. Again, as I noted, we in Alaska face a similar issue in terms of our teacher shortage and the inability to produce local educators. So there's something that my colleagues and I are discussing, and I want to ask you, maybe challenge you to jump in this. Is it only possible to have sufficient teacher quality by hiring graduates of teacher education programs? Or can you envision a different approach to creating quality learning experiences for all students, absent that?
I definitely think that we should look into other ways of hiring teachers, and that they, like, in many places it is already the reality that they don't have trained teachers, but so we should look into how we can use the resources we have in the settlements and communities, and see how they can help like teachers. I talked about a 2-teacher scheme in the defense, and it is not necessary that both teachers are trained teachers. Like there could be a one trained teacher, and then they could have an assistant to help manage the class or with other things, so that I definitely see possibilities in not trained teachers having a positive influence on the teacher shortage problem.
Are there any communities where community members have stepped in to perhaps create a community school model where parents or elders or others are also part of the teacher force?
I'm not aware of that. I don't think I've heard an example of that. Yeah.
We have some very small examples, but it's very difficult because, again, the resources don't go with that. If a community decides to do this, they're on their own generally. I think you've addressed that. Sorry, I'm looking at in the early childhood assumptions. I think what I might do is stop now, and then depending on the next set of questioning, I may ask permission to come back.
Yes, thank you, Diane, for your contribution. And we move on immediately. Michael Patton, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, and greetings. And let me congratulate you on a very fine and comprehensive dissertation and an excellent presentation today. I know this is a stressful situation to be engaged in having us ask you difficult questions. So I wanted to actually not make it a kind of exam framework, but more of a evaluation dialogue together, because I think you've got an important future in contributing to evaluation. So I want to share with you some of the issues that come up for me that relate to where the field of evaluation is. And I'm not so much looking for a particular answer, but more, as I think Diane illustrated, want to stimulate your thinking about some of these issues beyond the dissertation as you look ahead. The dissertation speaks for itself and is a high quality piece of work. And the very constraints of the dissertation and what that involves serves its own purpose, but now you're moving forward into professional practice, and so to broaden the scope of the dialogue is how I think we may best use our time, since it's maybe the only conversation you and I get to have. So I'm going to ignore all those other people in the audience and invite you to do that. You and I are going to have a conversation together. One of my main issues in 50 years of evaluation has been getting evaluation findings used and in what we've learned about how to work with people around being able to hear. One of the things we've learned is that when evaluation findings are primarily negative, it's very hard for people to hear them. In fact, there's considerable evidence we use as a rule of thumb that to have negative findings heard, you almost need a ratio of 5 positives to every 1 negative in order for things to be heard. I would say your ratio is considerably the opposite of that. And I wonder if you could address what some of the positives and strengths are in the school system and in the education system. Based on your presentation, you would think there was nothing going on. And that's going to be hard for people to hear. So let's turn that upside down for a moment and imagine that you're coming to me as a member of the education community. How would you start off with a more positive framing of what you found before you get into all the difficulties there are? What's going well?
In my defense, I said that the formal education system is still very young, and despite the few years we have had with formal education, I think we have done very good in terms of raising the education level in the country. And we still speak Greenlandic, and we are still learning, speaking, and taught in Greenlandic up until grade 10 at least. And then when you continue in the education system, it's primarily Danish, but the fact that we are still using our language in the education system is a very positive thing compared to other indigenous communities in the Arctic. Yeah. Another positive thing is that all the people I talked to and interviewed and all the meetings I observed, they all wanted the same thing. They all wanted better learning conditions for the children. They are all working very hard to reach the goals of that is being set and to create good schools and so on. But the sad thing is that they just don't have the resources, capacity, time to get there. But
Good. Well, from a change strategy point of view, part of the reason the identifying positives can be helpful is that one of the theories of change is building on strengths rather than focusing on deficits. That you identify what's going well, celebrate that, and use that to correct the deficits. There is, in fact, and this relates to Diane's important point about decolonizing, which is a major thrust in evaluation of these days. There are, from a change point of view, there are real tensions and conflicts between bottoms-up empowerment, culturally responsive, and strength-based approaches and accountability regulatory approaches. So the emphasis on accountability and the kind of strengths you just identified have some tensions in. And I want to invite you to think for a moment about, based on your data and your immersion in the study, and the future work you do in evaluation, the accountability framing is a very traditional colonial kind of frame compared to the more bottoms-up empowering kinds of culturally responsive framings. Those things are in tension, and they're major thrusts in both directions. So I wonder if you might reflect on not one or the other being the way to go, but how to manage the tensions that exist between those different directions.
yeah, in my dissertation I talked about external and internal accountabilities, and I think that this way of thinking, the external accountability is something that comes from outside, and therefore practitioners may have little ownership regarding to the indicators that is being used when using this type of accountability system. And on the other hand, with the internal accountability system, that is it's built on the culture that is built up in schools, and that way that in response to the being based on the culture of the school and the cooperations between the teachers, it is, research has shown that it is a more effective way than external accountability. So I definitely think that it's internal accountability is the way to go. You can't have external accountability indicators without having built up a culture in the school that looks at internal accountability.
Excellent. Thank you for that. A couple other things that we could reflect on together. In your initial framing, you had the various frameworks that you began with. Accountability and evaluation was at the core, at the bottom, and the larger framework was complexity theory. Talk about how complexity theory has informed your work. What has that brought to your work? How has that helped you make sense of what's going on? What do you pull from complexity theory?
That's a good question. Complexity theory has informed a lot of my work, both in the processes in the beginning of my dissertation, and it's complexity theory explained in a simple way is the difference of the different types of problems that we have in reality. Like we can have a simple problem where we have to bake a cake, and then we can follow a recipe or formula, and then we can expect roughly uniform results. We can expect the same cake even though other people are making it. With complicated problems, it is a little harder because you need expertise, and there you can have an example with sending a rocket to the moon. Like, you have to develop the technology first, and it's hard, but once you get to that level, you can reproduce the same, but expertise is with the correct expertise. And with complex problems, it's a world of the unknown, because you can't expect the same results. And here you can have, we can take the example of raising a child. Like, you can raise a child and it goes well, but it doesn't guarantee the success of raising another, because each child is different. And I use that way of thinking into it really helped me visualize like the different contexts we have in Greenland, different schools, and the different systems that are in place in each place. Like, we have so many layers of stakeholders and factors that affect how each school is thriving or not. So I guess the short answer is that I really liked the way how complexity theory sets up different systems, and how all these systems are interlinked with each other and can affect each other.
Great answer. I appreciate that. You've been very thoughtful about it. So let me ask you to connect what you just said with the previous discussion about accountability, what does complexity theory tell us even about internal accountability? How would you use what you've learned about complexity to inform accountability?
That every internal accountability in each school will be different according to what culture there is, and it should be, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a piece of it. But part of what the folks with complexity are suggesting, accountability almost inevitably has a regulatory, controlling kind of connotation, and so the shift to people taking responsibility for learning and adaptation, because accountability suggests that you can control, have predetermined outcomes, and have control over attaining those. In complex, turbulent situations, responsibility for learning and adaptation in a bottoms-up sense is a different skill set and a different way of operating. And I think you've identified that nicely in your discussion of the tensions that emerge. And one thing to consider is whether the language of accountability, even internal accountability, is so laden with control and kind of being in charge, top-down command kind of connotations, that it doesn't serve well to do that diverse piece. Let me ask one more question related that builds on this in some ways. It's another tough one, but it is partly about the challenges of the different languages that come into play, and some of the confusion I think that creates when we're trying to work with the different stakeholders you've identified about what to do. So in your step 3 of your presentation, where you talk about really 3 different kind of things. I'm going to ask you to sort them out in a way and connect them together, but distinguish them, because they are different things. One is strategy. So you've got stuff about what the strategy for changing is. Then you've got stuff about developing a theory of change. And then you've got stuff about stating principles to guide action. Strategy, theory of change, and principles are actually quite different approaches to change. So you've got those sort of all in that one step. Sort that out. How would you talk to people in education about what is the role of strategy, what's the role of theory of change, what's the role of principles, why do we do all those things if we do them all, what does each contribute? As Diane said, that's a whole dissertation by itself, but since you've introduced all that language, let me give you a chance to sort it out a little bit.
So my suggestion is to formulate first of all a strategy that can lay out the overall goals of the education system. What is the vision? What is it that we want, and where do we want to go, and how do we want to get there? In the strategy, and then the reason behind the reason why I took the theory of change in this step is that I don't feel like there has been a theory of change in the current strategy of education. Like we state objectives of where we want to go, but we don't there's no theory of change, like how are we going to get there. So I really think that we should lay out also and discuss how, when we set up objectives and goals, how we're going to reach them, and with what activities are we going to reach them, and who should be responsible for what. And the reason behind the principles is that we have such different contexts in Greenland, and I really think that it would not be good if we stated like only one way to do things, and it also goes against the way of thinking behind complexity view, that everything is different, and that, yeah, I really think that these objectives and activities, that they should be able to be adapted to what the local context is able to do in terms of capacity and resources.
Excellent, very thoughtful, and again, I congratulate you on your fine piece of work. I'm going to close with one final question that builds on what you just said, and that is the contextual diversity and the need for honoring that contextual diversity, because your fourth step is to identify best practices, and it's possible to argue that from a complexity theory point of view, in contextual variation, best practices is a misnomer, that there aren't any best practices, there are only contextually appropriate practices that will vary. Best suggests that there's one practice that works regardless of context. So how do you square the language of the best practices with contextual diversity and responsive evaluation?
I think it can be squared in this sense that best practices can, like, a lot of times a lot of concepts or things are very abstract and hard to imagine or hard to do. The way I think we can get out of this is by using best practices as an example of how to do things, and then and that they should be, the activities behind the best practices or the theories should be wide enough that they can be adapted to the local context.
Well, thank you for your work. I've learned a lot from reading your dissertation. I appreciated the opportunity to dialogue with you, and appreciate your thoughtful reflections and answers, and look forward to hearing about the important and good things you do going forward. I'll turn it back to you now.
Yes, thank you for your contribution, Michael. And now to our third examinator, Kevin Perry. The floor is yours, please.
I'll just say Stitten, is that okay?
I don't know what you should say, or should he use the microphone?
You should use the microphone.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for a very relevant presentation. You actually killed most of my questions, so that's quite good. But I'm thinking a lot about Paul Fryer. Do you know his work? Paul Fryer? No. No? Okay. That kills that question too. Damn. Okay. One thing that's very clear, working here at the university, there's a very distinct lack of young men coming into the university. What can the educational system do to raise their curiosity in education and learning?
regarding to the special classes, like 8 out of 10 special class students with well-being and behavioral problems are boys. And this can indicate that the school and the way we teach our children have been made so that it fits better with girls, if I can generalize in that way, that it fits with children who can sit and listen and behave. I think we should, to a great extent, find ways to teach that, so that we teach and learn while we are active, like doing things outside and being more out in the field. We have a great nature and geography just outside the door, and we have a lot of possibility into how science can be brought out of the classroom and then out, where maybe we can catch the curiosity of young boys better. And
yeah, I suppose that comes together with a sort of early discussion about how you include the local community, because a lot of research shows that boys are very interested in active learning, so maybe including local communities like hunters and fishers, and getting young men into sort of a business sort of line, but just using local teachers. But well, I'm going to bring you back into the sort of examination frame of mind. I'm just going to ask you some very practical questions about your research. And the first one is, like, knowing what you know now, if you was to start again, what would you do differently with your PhD research?
that's a good question. I thought about it a couple of weeks ago. In terms of practical process, I would have taken PhD courses earlier, so that it could have saved me a lot of times in terms of reading and writing a lot of things. But also in my dissertation, I write that I had a different research design starting out. In the beginning, it was the goal was to set up developmental evaluation projects around different municipalities and schools. But given time and resources, and also the more I read, the more I learned that there are so many things that it's a systems problem, and therefore I got very interested in how and why the governance systems have been shaped the way they are, and there's a lot of things that I could have done, but I wouldn't have ended up with this result. So
Okay. So what are the limitations of your thesis?
the limitations of my thesis is that the intention of this thesis and dissertation is not that it is representative. I interviewed about 30 people, system leaders and teachers, but they don't tell the whole, like, by talking to them I get an indication of how things are, but I can't say that it's the same across all schools and classrooms, because I simply don't have enough informants to be able to make that argument.
during your presentation, you spoke a lot about it's difficult to get qualified teachers in Greenland. What can the government do about creating some sort of program to attract more local people to become teachers, or attract more qualified teachers to Greenland? What can be done about that?
I think the discourse says a lot, and the discourse around the school and the teacher job is generally very negative. And I think a change in discourse could do a lot. Like that's the first thing, and then a second thing could be to improve the working conditions of teachers. It could be, I don't know, salaries, and I said in my dissertation, in the defense, that every fourth teacher is experiencing stress symptoms. That indicates that the teachers are very busy, and more should be done that their work is working conditions are better. Yeah. In terms of attracting teacher students to the university, I don't think it's the way to go to lower the requirements, because that would not. You may get more teacher students in the beginning, but in the end you wouldn't have a better quality.
And so my final question is, what's next? Do you have a next step? Do you have a postdoc in mind? How can you continue this research?
That's a new question. To be honest, I don't know what the next step is in terms of what research I'm going to pursue, but I am very interested in evaluation and children in Greenland, and so I don't see that my research area it should be only about the school and education system, but how the different systems are working together and how we can improve that. Are areas that I would really like to work with.
Thanks for your reflections.